In the sterile silence of a prison cell, an elderly man sits hunched over a table, his weathered hands moving with delicate precision. Samuel Little does not draw landscapes, he recreates the faces of the dead. With hauntingly accurate detail, he sketches the eyes and unique expressions of women he hasn't seen in decades. These aren't fantasies, but biological blueprints of his own atrocities. Each portrait is a window into a memory he kept locked away, a visual trophy of a life he extinguished. To any casual observer, he looks like a harmless grandfather, but he lived as a ghost for half a century. Little was never the kind of monster that fit a Hollywood profile. He was a displaced person, a drifter who navigated the forgotten fringes of society. He spent decades crisscrossing 19 states, and he moving like a shadow through truck stops and dive bars. He had no permanent address or digital footprint, allowing him to stay in one place without being noticed. This nomadic lifestyle was his greatest offense. He understood that a man with no home could disappear at a moment's notice, leaving behind a cold trail. He was a student of human apathy, knowing exactly how to slip through the system. His selection process was as calculated as his movements. Little didn't target the wealthy, he sought the marginalized, women living on the jagged edges of the world. He looked for those struggling with addiction or poverty, operating under a dark assumption. He believed the world wouldn't look for them. He gambled on the idea that if a disposable woman disappeared, the authorities would look the other way. To Samuel Little, these women were the perfect prey because their lives were already considered less valuable by society. He targeted those he felt were invisible, ensuring that his crimes would remain buried under layers of systemic neglect. This cruelty extended to his method of murder. He didn't use weapons that left obvious evidence. Instead, he relied on physical strength, using blunt force and strangulation. To investigators who found the bodies, the scenes lacked the typical hallmarks of a homicide. Because there were no stab wounds or gunshot injuries, many of his crimes were tragically misclassified. Across the country, his murders were written off as accidental drug overdoses or deaths by natural causes. This non-violent appearance allowed him to evade the FBI's radar for 3 decades, as his body count grew in the shadows of an indifferent and overworked justice system. The first spark of conflict ignited in 2012 at a Kentucky homeless shelter. Little was picked up on a routine narcotics warrant, which seemed like a minor arrest for a man with such a long record. However, this time, a DNA sample was taken and uploaded into a national database. The system finally saw him, producing an explosive genetic match that linked him directly to 3 unsolved cold cases in Los Angeles from the late 1980s. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. While the police thought they had caught a triple murderer, Texas Ranger James Holland noticed something terrifying. As James Holland mapped Little's lifelong travel history, a pattern emerged that spanned the entire nation. The dates and locations of Little's movements overlapped with hundreds of other missing person reports and accidental deaths. It became clear that the 3 victims in California were just the tip of a massive, submerged iceberg of violence. James Holland realized they weren't looking at a mere local killer, but the most prolific and dangerous predator in American history. A man who had left a trail of grief from coast to coast. The ghost had finally been captured and placed behind bars. But the true, bone-chilling scale of his horror was still largely unknown to the world. He sat in his cell, pencil scratching against paper, as the weight of 30 years of secrets finally began to collapse. revealing a nationwide graveyard that had been hidden in plain sight. James Holland leaned across the table, his eyes locked on the elderly man who held the secrets to 100 tragedies. The Texas Ranger knew that to win this game, he had to speak a language little understood, the language of importance. He didn't press for names or dates initially. He asked about the work. He treated the interrogation as an oral history of a dark pioneer. Little, sensing a captive audience that didn't judge, but instead appreciated his cunning, felt the pride of a craftsman. This wasn't a confession in the eyes of the killer. It was a legacy being recorded. The psychological chess match was underway, and Holland was moving the pieces with calculated grace, leading Little toward a mountain of evidence he had spent a lifetime hiding. The silence didn't just break, it evaporated. Little's narcissism was a powerful engine. Oh, and once it was ignited by Holland's feigned respect, the floodgates opened. He didn't speak out of a sudden burst of remorse, but out of an insatiable desire to be recognized as the most prolific serial killer in history. He wanted the title. He wanted to be the name the FBI talked about for the next century. He began to narrate his cross-country journeys with a level of detail that was both impressive and terrifying. He spoke of the humidity in Georgia, the neon lights of Las Vegas, and the specific alleys in Los Angeles where he found his prey. Each word was a betrayal of the anonymity he had once cherished. He was no longer a ghost. He was a narrator of his own atrocities, basking in the spotlight. Then came the art. Samuel Little wasn't just a talker, he was an artist of the macabre. As he sat in his cell, he began to use the pencils provided to him to create a gallery of the dead. He drew with a photographic memory that chilled the investigators to the bone. He captured the specific shade of a woman's lipstick, the way a scarf was tied, or the unique structure of a jawline. Each portrait was a trophy, a visual manifestation of the displaced persons he had encountered. These drawings became the most vital tools for the FBI, turning the killer's own pride into a roadmap for justice. Each sketch was a haunting reminder of the lives he had claimed, a visual bridge to a past that many hoped had been forgotten. The emotional weight of these sketches was staggering. Consider the women he met in the early 80s, whose faces he recreated with startling accuracy decades later. He described them as if they were characters in a movie, out detached from the reality that they were human beings with dreams. He talked about how they looked in the moonlight before he took their lives. This coldness was the hallmark of his nature. While the world saw a tragedy, he saw a successful acquisition. The investigators had to suppress their disgust to keep the information flowing, humanizing the victims in their own minds, while Little continued to treat them as objects in his grand, dark narrative. This process exposed a deep wound in the American justice system. Why had it taken so long? The answer lay in the systemic neglect of the marginalized. These women were the lesser dead in the eyes of many, people whose struggles made them easier to ignore. The tension between the current investigators and the decades of apathy was a constant presence. Holland and his team were fighting against time and a history of indifference. Every identified victim was a small victory against a system that had failed them. They were finally reclaiming the dignity of the women Little had tried to erase. However, the horror only deepened as the numbers rose. The count surpassed 40, then 60, and kept climbing toward the staggering figure of 93. But the most terrifying realization wasn't just the number. It was the fact that for many of these women, There was no record of them even being gone, no missing persons reports, no searches. They were ghosts twice over. The scale of the horror was expanding beyond the reach of the law, revealing a shadow world where a predator could operate with impunity. The investigation was discovering the true depth of an invisible American tragedy that had been festering in the dark corners of the nation. The gravity of the situation crystallized when the FBI finally made it official. Samuel Little was no longer just a suspect. He was formally designated as the most prolific serial killer in American history. With 93 confirmed confessions, he had surpassed the dark tallies of Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy combined. The sheer scale of his violence was astronomical, stretching across 19 states and 4 decades. This certification transformed the investigation into a national tragedy that could no longer be ignored. It was a moment of somber validation for James Holland and the team of analysts who had spent years untangling the web of his memories. The displaced person, who had once moved through the shadows of society like a ghost, had finally been forced into the harsh, unforgiving light of historical record. As the truth solidified, a wave of long-delayed phone calls began to ripple across the country. In small towns and sprawling cities, families who had spent 40 years wondering why their sisters, mothers, or daughters had never come home finally received the answers they had stopped praying for. Each call represented a bridge built over a chasm of uncertainty. For some, it was a moment of bone-deep exhaustion. For others, a release of decades of pent-up grief. These women were not just statistics or marginalized labels anymore. They were real people, Nancy, Audrey, Roberta, whose absence had left jagged holes in the lives of those they left behind. The closure was painful, a reopening of old wounds, but it was a necessary reckoning. The silence that had swallowed their loved ones was finally broken by investigators confirming that their long-lost relatives had not simply vanished by choice, but had been stolen. The very portrait Samuel Little had created to boast of his achievements became the ultimate instruments of his undoing. It was a macabre irony that his narcissism provided the evidence needed to identify the nameless. Each stroke of his pencil, intended to memorialize his dominance over his victims, served instead as a beacon for justice. FBI analysts used these sketches to match against cold case files that had gathered dust for generations. The specific arch of a brow or the tilt of a chin captured in Little's drawings allowed detectives to put names to the unidentified remains found in Georgia woods or Texas ditches. His artwork, once meant to be a private gallery of trophies, was transformed into a public ledger of his crimes, proving that even a predator's pride can be harnessed to restore the truth. The end for Samuel Little came quietly in a California prison hospital in late 2020. He was 80 years old, his body finally failing where his conscience never had. The man who had lived in the shadows died in the clinical glare of state custody. He died without ever uttering a word of genuine remorse or offering a single apology to the families he had shattered. To the very last breath, he remained a man defined by a chilling emotional void, a predator who viewed his horrific life's work with a sense of accomplishment rather than regret. He left behind a legacy of ghosts, women whose lives he had ended and whose identities he had nearly erased. Yet, his death did not signal the end of the investigation. Instead, it marked a transition, moving the focus away from the man himself and toward the unfinished business of identifying every single one of his victims. The true resolution of this tragedy lies not in the death of the killer, but in the restoration of dignity to the women he targeted. The narrative shifted from the legend of a prolific murderer to the humanity of the individuals he tried to render invisible. Justice, in this case, was more than just a life sentence. It was the act of remembering. However, the mystery is far from solved. On the FBI's official website, a digital gallery remains, rows of sketches drawn by Little's own hand that have yet to be linked to a name or family. These faces, captured in graphite, are an open invitation to the world to look closer. They are the final puzzles in a cross-country map of sorrow, waiting for a friend or a neighbor to recognize them and bring them home from the shadows. The ghost is gone, but the search for his final victims continues, a haunting reminder that the light of truth must reach every dark corner